You know, for a story that originates from the East, Berserk sure focused on Western folklore and mythologies for a good portion of its run. From introducing elves with Puck in the very first chapter, to now populating Fantasia with all kinds of abominations like Norse giants, Greek hydras, English dragons, and the ever-elusive Headless Knight from European folktales, most of Berserk's fantasy elements are decidedly Western, owing to its setting and framing and such. That's perhaps why Miura decided that the greatest villain of his series was going to have to be Eastern, and introduced Emperor Ganishka and his Kushan Empire to the story from the beginning of the Conviction arc. We've spoken at length about what made Ganishka a Dread Emperor in his Origins video, which you can find out on our channel. So today, we thought we'd talk a bit about just how he achieved that moniker of his, and that's where the Daka and Pishacha come in. These monsters created with Eastern magic are one of the core reasons why Ganishka's world conquest was as successful as it was, despite his human soldiers thinking otherwise. So, without further ado, this is the Daka and Pishacha Gana, explored. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Daka. Demon soldiers birthed from a Behelit. We'll start with the foot soldier variant of Ganishka's demon army, although, to be honest, their creation process is far more ghastly than that of a Pishacha. But you'll see what we mean by that in just a second. First, we must address the need for a demon army in the first place, because why does Ganishka, the literal strongest apostle in existence, need an army of demons when he can just take out multiple apostles with a single thunderstrike in his mist form? To put it bluntly, and in the words of the Emperor no less, human soldiers are simply no match for inhuman opponents. When Griffith's War Demon Lancer unit executes a sneak attack on Kushan-occupied Windham City, Ganishka notes that his regular troops didn't even stand a chance against Locus and his knights. The reborn Band of the Falcon tore through Kushan soldiers like a hot knife through butter, and so he gave one of his lieutenants the order to lure them into a retrenchment and let them face the Daka. Now, this is where things got interesting, confusing, and downright terrifying at the same time. The term Daka has several meanings depending on which language it's being associated with and how you're pronouncing it, using it, etc. In Hindi, that word can alternatively mean postal mail or committing the act of robbery, but in its original Sanskrit usage, the word Daka is associated with donor or sacrifice. Ghoulishly appropriate considering a sacrifice is how a Daka was created in the first place. See, Ganishka's campaign of global conquest was well underway even before he became an apostle. Back then, he relied on more conventional Kushan war tactics, like turning captives into war slaves who were then forced to fight on his behalf to earn their freedom. By doing this, he preserved his own main army, who would often just fire through the war slaves in order to hit the enemy where it hurt most. This allowed him to keep his resources intact and rolling endlessly, crushing all opposition under the feet of his mighty elephants. But when he became an apostle, he also became aware of the God Hand's general idea for the future of the world itself, and that means he knew of the approaching Falcon of Light. Now, usually, when a human reincarnates into an apostle, they become instinctively subservient to the God Hand on a physiological level, to the point where even thoughts of betraying them can get you murked, like Zod did to Wild. But some apostles, like Zod himself and Locus, whom we mentioned earlier, had very strong egos as human beings, and those egos travel with them into their second lives, making them a fair bit more autonomous and more powerful than their baser counterparts. Locus was a knight before he died, and so was Grunbeld, and Zod too, but probably in just like a bestial warrior kind of sense. Ganishka was an emperor before he got reincarnated, so when he came back, his ego as a ruler in the blood-stained world of Berserk came with him, and Ganishka realized that if he wanted to rule the world, then he'd have to stand up to God himself. And by God, we mean the God Hand. Knowing his own nature was a demonic being, Ganishka must have realized that he needed demons of his own to combat the God Hand, and that's when he tracked down Daiba, commissioned him to create the man-made Behelit, and assembled as many sorcerers as he could, because Ganishka was going to wage war like no one in the current era of Berserk could. Like we said at the beginning of this section, human soldiers are no match for inhuman opponents, so the Dread Emperor decided to siphon the power of evil for his own army. A Daka is essentially a human fetus infused with the power of evil, so that when it matures, it bursts out of its mom alien style and immediately becomes a loyal soldier of his demon army. The Daka are created thanks to Daiba's man-made Behelit, which he made with the stitched-together bodies of living apostles and lots of amniotic fluid. When a pregnant woman was lowered into this man-made Behelit, the offspring in her womb would be saturated with evil surging within it from the interiors of the apostles, and a Daka would burst forth like a living nightmare. These demonic soldiers are penned into cages after birth, trained in the arts of war, and raised into horned and fang-toothed monstrosities whom you can somehow still feel extremely sorry for. Look at this full-page spread of a Daka in Lamalar and tell us his eyes don't make you feel disturbingly sympathetic towards him. We don't blame you for feeling that way, especially considering the fact that their diet was basically their mother's, and we think they knew that. But keeping that to one side, you can clearly tell that these guys were supposed to be just rank and file, or the first tier of Ganishka's demon army, because of how many of them were debuted at the same time. Fodder characters often enter stories in swarms, and sadly for these demon babies, that was the case. The Daka were mowed down like dry grass on an autumn evening by Locus and his war demons, but that doesn't mean they weren't useful at all. When you take the logic that we used for the creation of the Daka and apply it in the inverted context of Ganishka using his Daka against human soldiers before encountering Griffith's reborn band of the Falcon, it would still be 100% accurate. What human armies do you think will be able to stand up to devil spawns that can literally chew their heads off before they even land a blow on them? The answer is none, and no doubt the Daka were crucial to Ganishka's war efforts before he reached the middle of all lands. In the east, there must be dozens of stories about how the Dread King's demon army swallowed their lands whole in a single night of fog and death, and that's how we choose to remember these guys. Then again, the Daka were fodder in the context of our story, so let's move things up a notch and talk about the other component of Ganishka's demon army, and that's the Pishacha. A stampede of animalistic fiends, Ganishka's Pishacha Gana, and how they worked with the Daka explain. The word Pishacha has many interpretations in Indic religions, but the one most commonly associated with it is fiendish spirits in service to evil, and by that metric, Miura's Pishacha fit the bill, at least on a spiritual level. They were quietly introduced alongside the Daka during Princess Charlotte's Griffith rescue mission, where we saw multiple gigantic elephants charge the war demons in full body armor and running on 2 feet as opposed to 4. And yes, you did hear us correctly there. We understood exactly what they were when the story shifted to the POV of the Black Swordsman party, thanks to the bestest of all best girls, Shirke. While Guts, Serpico, and Isidro were focused on taking down the walking harpoon-equipped crocodiles that were attacking their little shack shelter for the night, Shirke explained that these Pishacha Gana were nothing more than familiars. In European folklore, a familiar is a supernatural spirit or entity that serves as a guardian-type figure for a mage, and has close spiritual ties to their summoners' souls. In Berserk, the same concept applies, but in a far more horrific manner. A Pishacha is a familiar created by a human spirit that has been cast into an animal's body. This animal can likely be any kind of animal, but in Berserk, we see 4 kinds of terrestrial, aquatic, and reptilian beasts being transformed into monsters. The first we've already spoken of, which is the elephant Pishacha. These guys are massive. They can walk on 2 feet, grab weapons with their palm-like hands, are armored out to tuskers, and can maul you worse than an actual crazy elephant. Then there are the crocodile familiars that attacked Guts & Co. These guys are walking reptiles with harpoons secured to their wrists that they can use as melee weapons as well as projectiles when necessary. And when you consider just how dangerous crocodiles are, even non-possessed, then you can understand why we call these guys the stuff of nightmares. Then there are the enchanted tigers, or the tiger Pishacha, which are basically enlarged tigers with a nasty set of demon fangs. These tigers are often ridden by the Daka as makeshift cavalry, and they also prowl the streets of Windham as lookouts for the Dread Emperor alongside their terrestrial and reptilian brethren. The final kind of Pishacha we see in Berserk are the Makara, and these are the real heavy hitters of the bunch. The term Makara is the original Sanskrit word from which the Hindi word from crocodiles is derived, but it was used to describe the traditional Vahana of ancient Indian sea gods and goddesses. In Hindu mythology, it's typical to see a god being accompanied by an animal companion, and the Makara was a legendary creature amongst them all. Often described as a half-mammal, half-aquatic creature, the Makara is interchangeably the mount of the Varuna, god of the oceans, or Ganga, the personified deity of the river Ganga, and the goddess that symbolizes purity in Hinduism. There are other associations for the Makara as well, but these are the main two according to our research. Miura's specific design of the Makara seems to be based on the designs found at the Sun Temple of Konark, mainly because of its elephantine features. The Makara is basically a blue whale possessed by a Kushan sorcerer, whose possession somehow causes the whale to sprout fangs and breathe on land, and also develop an honest-to-God trunk that makes it perhaps the least tankable unit in Ganishka's increasingly RPG-like demon army. A single Makara is said to have the power to sink 10 warships, and when you consider the fact that Guts has to go berserk, or at least semi-berserk, to face one of them, let alone 5, then you can appreciate Daiba's description of them being the chiefs of his Pishacha. Using these familiars, Ganishka had accomplished a lot in the story. While the Demon King employed conventional battle strategies in the light of day and took what successes his war slaves and thousands of soldiers could bring him, his actual attacks would often take place under the cover of darkness and fog. Ganishka and Daiba had come up with such an intricate system of controlling the Pishacha and Daka that it's frankly understated just how insane their military accomplishments were up until Griffith humiliated them. The Dread Emperor's actual apostle form was that of a luminous body, gathering and commanding wind and water elementals to give him his mist form. By manipulating these elementals, Ganishka was able to expand up to hundreds of meters in size and use his own body as a homing/communications device. After conquering the capital of Midland, Ganishka keeps Wyndham blanketed in a layer of fog that allows him to track any movement occurring within the entire city. He sees and feels what his patrolling Pishacha cannot, and can immediately deal with threats by using thought transference and commanding the Harashada controlling those Pishacha to neutralize the threats. He can also use this fog as an offensive measure to blanket the field of battle and hide his soldiers within it until they can finally strike. This, combined with the fact that he attacks with his demonic forces at night, makes his Daka and Pishacha forces the core of his new military strategy. The prowess of this strategy is revealed in the aftermath of Guts' face-off against the Familiars, when Daiba claims that the entire western shoreline of the Holy See territories has been subdued in a single night. Ganishka rolled the fog out, Daiba's Harashada projected themselves into his Pishacha, and off they went into the homes of everyone living on the shores bordering Britannis, leaving not a single shred or morsel of evidence of an attack come morning. It is perhaps the single most effective military move we've seen in Berserk since Griffith captured Doldry all the way back during the Golden Age. But the conquest of Britannis' shoreline also exposed the flaw in the operation of these demonic soldiers. A Pishacha was controlled by a Kushan sorcerer whose spiritual body inhabited it while it was serving, so if you took out the sorcerer, the familiar would return to its original animalistic state, which is exactly what happens thanks to Serpico. While the Daka don't seem to be directly controlled by groups of Harashada owing to their human origins, they too are susceptible to the sorcerer's thought transference, because when Ganishka's demon assault on Britannis fails, and his demon army takes a massive hit, Daiba commands the Harashada to order all Daka and Pishacha still living and breathing in Britannis to commit suicide. Once a Daka or a Pishacha dies, the essence of evil that had possessed their bodies is dissipated, and they return to their original forms, much like apostles. The reason for this order being given was simple. Ganishka didn't want his enemies to discover the secrets to his successful global empire, and as distasteful as the command might have been, it did end up working. When General Owen was surveying the battlefield of Britannis in the aftermath of Ganishka's retreat, he remarked that the previous night seemed like a mere nightmare considering he could no longer see the monsters that attacked the Holy City. In reality, those monsters had just turned back to their original physical forms and now littered Britannis like the rubble the city had nearly been reduced to. This is what makes the Daka and Pishacha so much better than the crude tactics of the land army, as Daiba puts it, because they are all serving to the bitter end and then some. And even if they die, your enemies would never know if they existed in the first place or not, because all they'd see are either crocodiles, whales, tigers, elephants, or dead Kushan soldiers wearing relatively light lamellar armor. The Daka and Pishacha might have been chump change compared to the reborn band of the Falcon, but that isn't a fair comparison anyway. Taken in isolation, they are amongst the nastiest and most brutally effective shock troops we've ever seen in Berserk, and we've lived through the days of the ultra-armored mega-heavy tank cavalry that was Adon Cobberwaltz's Blue Whale Knights. A marvelous verdict, but that's all for this video. The Daka and Pishacha are some of the most unique and over-the-top tertiary villains we've seen in Berserk, and they introduce a nice sense of diversity to the story that it was starting to feel devoid of after the eclipse. Having said that, what are some of your favorite monsters and beasts from the world of Berserk? Are there any that you want to see in an upcoming video? Let us know in the comments section down below, and we'll see you guys in the next one.